Hi, I'm Holly Rainwater with the Coshocton Public Library. Welcome to Tea and Suffrage. We're celebrating the centennial of women winning the right to vote. Remember, women weren't given the vote, they won it. They took it, they worked for it. um, and this is the centennial year, and we were planning on having a real tea party at the library. We're going to invite you to come and wear a period costume or wear these colors, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And we were going to serve you tea and little sandwiches and scones and strawberry jam, and we were going to talk about women's history. But we're in the days of COVID right now, so we're having a virtual tea party. So hopefully you have a little cup of tea right now that you can drink. I've got my cup of tea, and I have to show you my teacup. Votes for Women. This is an authentic replica of a tea service that was used back then, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that later. But I want you to know that just by watching this program today, you have the opportunity to win one of these for yourself along with some other prizes, and I'll tell you about that a little later. So I want to explain my outfit. I've got my suffragist hat. I'm also going to wear it to the beach and in the garden, and I love it. I've got a sash. I made this sash. The colors for the suffragist movement in America are purple, white, and yellow or gold. So the purple is for loyalty, the white is for purity, and the gold is for hope. And often these sashes, they wore these sashes when they marched and when they picketed. Sometimes they wrote on the sashes, votes for women. I decided to go with buttons. So I have a button that I bought, a centennial button, and I have this cute little pin. I don't know if you can see that. It's a Vote for Women teacup. It has a little spoon. I got that off of Etsy. I have this pin. It's women. It's brass. It's sort of reflecting there. Women, happy women dancing and celebrating. I've had that one for years. This is in honor of my great grandmother, Lily Margaret, and this was her pin. It's a lily of the valley. She was 32, 33 years old when women won the right to vote. And we had a conversation with her one day, my husband and I. She lived to be 101 and a half. And we were talking about a particular president, and I can't remember which one, but Kevin asked her if she voted for him. And she looked at him kind of funny, and then she said, "No, I wasn't allowed to vote in that election. That was before 1920. So I'm thinking about her today, and I've got also a dove for peace. And I got out her tea. This is her teapot, my great grandmother's teapot. So, tea and suffrage. I came up with the idea for a tea party because it's been a long time since we had a tea party at the library. And I thought, oh, I wonder if the suffragists drank tea or had tea parties. So one day I Googled tea and suffrage, and I found some really interesting information, and I would like to share that with you now. So, July 9th, 1848, a woman named Jane Hunt, a well-to-do New York woman who was also a Quaker, had a tea party, and she invited 3 other Quaker women to the tea party. Lucretia Mott, and I had heard of Lucretia Mott. I knew she was a Quaker and that she was an abolitionist. Also, her sister, Martha Wright, she was also a Quaker, an abolitionist, and she operated a station on the Underground Railroad. And Mary Ann McClintock, also a Quaker and an abolitionist. And then the 4th guest that she had was Elizabeth Cady Stanton, not a Quaker, but an abolitionist. And all 5 of these women were concerned about the plight of women in this country. So they got together to have tea, and while they were passing the sandwiches and drinking their tea, they were talking about their lives together and sort of commiserating. sort of airing their grievances about the world's injustices towards women. Now, Mott, Lucretia, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton had met 8 years before this in 1840. They both attended the World Anti-Slavery Convention in London. They were there. Mott was a delegate. Stanton was there as a newlywed. This was her honeymoon. She and her husband went to this anti-slavery convention. And both women were disappointed because they were not allowed to speak. Women were not allowed to speak, and they were segregated into their own roped off area where they had to be seen and not heard. So Stanton later wrote, as Mrs. Mott and I walked home arm in arm, commenting on the incidents of the day, we resolved to hold a convention as soon as we returned home, and to form a society to advocate the rights of women. So 8 years later, they were finally getting around to doing this. Life has a way of intervening. Stanton had 3 children in the space of those 8 years, and she was busy. Her husband wasn't always in good health, and she felt isolated, exhausted, and she felt like women were expected to do all this and they didn't really get any credit for it and were unappreciated. Women were not educated, although she was, and some women were, but on the whole, women weren't. They couldn't own property. They couldn't have custody of their children if there was a divorce or separation or whatever. The husband always had the children. So these women, sharing their grievances, together, finding support with each other, decided now's the time to have our convention. So they put this thing together in 10 days without Facebook, without social media to spread the word. Somehow they got the word out. 300 people attended. It was open only to women the first day, and men were allowed to come the second day. It was held in New York, and my mind is going blank right now. Seneca Falls, New York. And it's the Seneca Falls Convention, which is it's seen as the beginning of the women's suffrage movement. It's hard to say exactly when the women's movement began, but this is one of the dates that we all look toward as being toward the beginning. So 300 women, and Stanton got up and read in her opening remarks, she read this: "We are assembled to protest against a form of government existing without the consent of the governed, to declare our right to be free as man is free, to be represented in the government which we are taxed to support, to have such disgraceful laws as give man the power to chastise and imprison his wife, to take the wages which she earns, the property which she inherits, and in case of separation, the children of her love, to have these unjust laws, if possible, forever erased from our statute books." And then they presented a declaration of sentiments, and Stanton also wrote most of these. She was a very good writer, really had a way with words. And they sort of based this on the Declaration of Independence, and they were making it obvious how the Declaration of Independence only applies to men, white men. And so in the sentiments, number 9 was the resolution that women should have the right to vote. Now, all of the other 11 resolutions passed without a problem, but when it came to voting for this resolution, there were a lot of people who just didn't see this as a possibility. In this group of mostly women, mostly forward-thinking women, activists, abolitionists, they just could not wrap their heads around this idea that women should be able to vote or could be able to vote. So Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Frederick Douglass both made impassioned speeches in favor of this resolution, and in the end it did pass, but barely. So that gives us an idea of how radical that was for women to gain the vote. Okay, another area of tea and suffrage. We're going to fast forward to 1911. California is trying to pass their own, just a statewide suffrage amendment. And one of the things that they did was they marketed tea. In Northern California, they had equality tea. And in Southern California, votes for women tea. So there were ads in newspapers and magazines for this tea. You could buy it through a mail order service. You could get it in your grocery store. You could ask your grocer to carry it. The suffrage organization headquarters served it. Some tea rooms and cafes, restaurants, hotels served it, and some didn't. And the whole point of it was to spread the word about women's suffrage, to use it as a marketing technique, and also to raise money to support the suffrage movement. There was a woman in Los Angeles named Mrs. R.L. Craig. She was the only female member of the National Wholesale Grocers Association. Her husband had been a grocer, and she inherited his business, and she ran his business after his death. She was a former school teacher, and so she got this tea going in Southern California, and she also ran for office that year, and she won. She was elected to the LA Board of Education by a significant margin. So she was, like I said, she was a former teacher, she was a businesswoman, and a pioneer for new roles for women. Okay, and then the third and last thing I want to tell you about tea and suffrage. Alva Vanderbilt Belmont was a lady of high class, high standing. She was married to a Vanderbilt. She was part of that New York elite, although she wasn't part of it to begin with, but she worked her way into it. She was a whiz at PR, and she would have these big parties, and the press would come, and everybody wanted to get an invitation. And she was on the outside. The first party she had, she was an outsider, but she did not invite Mrs. Astor or her family. But it was a really big event in the social scene that year. So Mrs. Astor came to see her and asked for an invitation. So she got her invitation, and Mrs. Astor was the one. She sort of held the keys to the kingdom in New York. You may have read about her. I was so interested in Downton Abbey, and the fact that Mrs. Lady Grantham, Cora, comes from New York. She marries into the peerage in England. She becomes a lady because she's got money, and her money can save the estate. Well, that's similar to what Alva's daughter, Consuelo. Alva set up a marriage for her with the Duke of Marlborough, who was the first cousin of Winston Churchill. So Consuelo married him, went to live in England. It was a loveless marriage, and it was later annulled with her mother's blessing. She knew she shouldn't have done that to her daughter. But anyway, Alva herself married to a Vanderbilt. Mr. Vanderbilt cheated on her, and she divorced him, which was unheard of, or it happened very seldom, especially among the elite. And then she remarried a man named Mr. Belmont. I don't remember his first name, but and he had actually been a friend of her husband's, but they had a very happy marriage as far as I could tell from what I read, but then he died. So after he died in 1909, she became a suffragist, and she had a lot of money to put into it. She had this beautiful house, her summer cottage. It was an $11 million mansion in Newport, Rhode Island, where the other rich people had their summer cottages. Her house was called Marble House. And she built a tea house, a Chinese replica tea house on her property that could hold 100 women, 100 people, and she would have tea parties. And she had a set of dishes made, votes for women, and it's the cup and then the saucer, and then there were luncheon plates. And she hosted a few conferences there, and these were given, I read in one source, these were given as favors. When you bought your ticket to attend the conference, along with the ticket, you got to tour her house, and you also got to hear speakers such as Julia Ward Howe, and also Alva's daughter, Consuelo, who was a suffragist. And so she raised money with these tea parties. She raised awareness of women's issues, and she made it popular, you know, to be a suffragist. Now it was a thing, and you wanted, you know, as a society lady, you wanted to be seen in those circles. But she also took suffrage into the cities, or into New York City, into all the different boroughs. Alva opened 11 street front suffrage settlement clubs. So these were places where they could hold meetings, suffrage meetings. You could take public speaking classes, because women at that time didn't do much public speaking. And they needed to be comfortable in front of crowds. So they could take the classes. There was musical entertainment. There were reading rooms. And then, so these were in storefronts in all the different boroughs of New York, and they were open to the working class of women. And she also opened a lunchroom where a working woman, a working girl, or men came too, you could get a nice, tasty hot lunch for a nickel. And the dishes said votes for women. It was a kind of a different, they were actually gold. The lettering was in gold at the lunchroom. They had posters on the wall and literature that you could pick up. And so she knew that the suffrage movement really needed to go beyond the bounds of white middle class women, and so she helped to spread it into the working class and the women that had come from different countries, but who considered themselves Americans now, the immigrant population. So that is our third example of tea and suffrage. Now, just overall, tea is seen as a domestic, feminine, refined thing. Women were in charge of tea. Women had the key to the tea caddy in the home, and women determined when we drank tea and how much tea. Tea was seen as a healthy drink and almost medicinal. You know, if you watch period dramas or read books from the 1800s, if someone has an upset, say they get caught out in the rain, someone breaks their heart, they find a dead body in the library. Whenever they have an upset, someone says, "Oh, fetch a cup of tea," and someone else says, "And make it strong with lots of sugar." So tea was like I said, it was a very domestic thing. Also, it was a way for women to gather, to be sociable, to have friendships. And if you drank tea at home, if you were in the upper crust, tea was a chance Tea time was a chance to take off your corset and put on your tea gown, and experience just the room to breathe. Um, the suffragists were very aware of their public image. They were ridiculed and looked down upon. Um, and one of the things that was said about suffragists was that they were mannish, that they were trying to become men. And of course, what it meant to be a woman back then, that was a very narrow definition. And what the suffragists were asking was a very radical thing for women to get the vote. So one of the ways that they presented a positive public image was by always dressing up, wearing white and wearing lace and wearing hats and gloves and all the things and corsets, all the things that women wore back then, and drinking tea. Tea was an inoffensive thing to do. So it helped to perpetuate this image that I guess it was a matter of choosing their arguments, choosing their fights. They wanted the focus to be on winning the vote and not the individual character of each woman. So they tried to fit in that way, and tea helped them do it.
It was the end of ignorance. The demands of grown-up women could no longer be denied. Carrie Chapman Catt spoke of the long struggle for the vote.
It took George Washington 6 years to rectify men's grievances by war, but it took 72 years to establish women's rights by law. Woman's suffrage is a long story of hard work and heartache, crowned by victory.
It was 1920. The 19th Amendment had finally passed. American women could vote.
Tea and Suffrage Epilogue. If you have done much reading or watching of documentaries about the suffrage movement, you have discovered that, like in so many other periods of our history, racism reared its ugly head in the fight for women's suffrage. Black women were speaking out about women's rights at the same time the women's suffrage movement was unfolding in the mid-1800s. But because of their race, they were not equally heard. Black women also did not get white women's support as they fought for other equality measures like the 14th and 15th Amendments, which granted former slaves citizenship rights and gave black men voting rights. As a white woman, I feel very badly about this. So when I was researching this subject of tea and suffrage, I looked for the possibility that somewhere, sometime, maybe white women and black women, both fighting for the same thing, might have come together at a tea table. There was a very brief time when this might have happened. I mentioned earlier that Alva Belmont took the suffrage movement into New York City in order to expand it beyond white, middle, and upper class women. In early 1910, she worked with leading women in the African American community, such as Sarah Jane Smith Garnett and Irene Moorman, to form their own branch of the Political Equality Association. Belmont even provided them with a headquarters office. She also included African American women and immigrant women in weekend retreats at Beacon Towers, her Gothic-style castle in Sands Point. The backlash to this racial coalition was swift. White supporters balked at the news that Belmont had invited African American activists to a suffrage ball. Later, when 8 black activists attempted to dine in one of Belmont's suffrage lunchrooms, they were turned away, receiving box lunches and asked to eat elsewhere. Soon, participation in her organization, the Political Equality Association, fell away, and Belmont closed several chapters, including theirs. The gate to biracial cooperation had been opened, but it slammed quickly shut. Once again, white suffragists put their own interests above the interests of their black sisters. But wait, I also found this. In Rochester, New York, there's a statue created by Rochester sculptor Pepsi Ketavong and erected in 2001. The statue depicts Susan B. Anthony and Frederick Douglass deep in conversation. Between them is a table containing 2 books, 2 cups and saucers, and a pot of tea. Anthony and Douglass, both residents of Rochester, knew each other and fought in the same battles, although sometimes they battled each other. While they both believed in universal suffrage, they disagreed over which group should take precedence. Anthony advocating for women and Douglass advocating for black men. This issue divided them for a time, but in the end, they came back together. These 2 friends, sharing a cup of tea, were some of the most radical revolutionaries in our nation's history. They were visionaries, able to see beyond the power structures of their day and imagine a world where everyone is equal. What would they say about our nation today? We have made progress, but my, oh my, the struggle continues. It's easy to become disheartened and doubtful. But just look at these 2 who spent their entire lives fighting for freedom and equality. I think they would look back at us and ask, is there any better way to spend a life? There is always work to be done. Articles and books to be written, speeches to be made, meetings to attend, politicians to persuade, civil disobedience to be enacted, consciousness to be raised, hearts to be opened, miles to be traveled. But first, let's sit here together under the trees and have a cup of tea.